As our culture shifts from live shows to live streams, the Chicago Cultural Alliance finds it more important than ever to dive back into our roots, to create a platform that welcomes tough conversations, and to share our cultural stories of resilience. Welcome to Cultural Connections. Welcome to Cultural Connections. This is a visual podcast, and we've designed this to raise awareness of the voices within the arts community and the members of the Chicago Cultural Alliance, and also of our supporters. And in each episode, we'll be hearing from different cultural backgrounds. We'll hear from our different community members, and we'll talk about topics of cultural diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I am very excited and honored to join us is Angel Ysaguirre, who is the Executive Director of the Court Theater. Thank you for joining us, Angel.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
We are so honored to be able to award you the Chicago Cultural Champion Award. And we unfortunately did have to cancel our gala MOSAIC, which would have happened in May, where we would have given you this beautiful award. But we're excited to be here to honor you and to talk about the work that you're doing currently at the Court Theater. And obviously you have quite the record of experience in the cultural arts sector. That I'd love to talk more about your work over the years. And obviously one of the important things that we'll talk about too is the resilience of the arts sector, which we've had a difficult year as a whole. But I know that there's a lot of hope for the future, and I want to talk a bit about that too. But first, congratulations.
Thank you.
On the award. You've been at the Court Theater now 2 years?
2 years.
Yeah. And this year basically has been a very different year than I'm sure the year past. But tell me about your experience these last 2 years with Court Theater. Maybe start with that first year of what it looked like and what brought you to Court Theater.
Yeah. It's been really exciting. I mean, Court is the only sort of union regional theater on the south side of Chicago, which is a huge deal to me because it means it's the only theater of its size that's actually in a community of color. We know that people tend to travel less than 2 miles to get to the theaters that they go to. Yeah. And so there's this incredible opportunity at Court to have a truly diverse theater because of where the theater sits. Yeah. Making that even more interesting is the fact that it's a classic theater company. Yeah. And so people often don't think about classics and communities of color for whatever reason. I started my career in Chicago in the cultural sector at Illinois Humanities and created a program there called the Odyssey Project, which was actually based on the first year curriculum at the University of Chicago. The idea was to provide the same quality education for the poor that the wealthiest of Americans have access to. And the core curriculum at the University of Chicago is a great books or like a classics curriculum. And I was somewhat agnostic about it. I thought, this is what rich people get, and so let's provide it for poor folks. And a lot of people disagreed with that. They didn't think that people would respond, that audience would respond to that work, but that was not the case at all. And in fact, the text that people studied that they responded to most fervently was Plato's The Cave. And so for me, the challenge isn't how do you get communities of color to be interested in the classics, but really how do you conceive of the classics in a way that communities of color own them. So how do we reconceive of the canon? And how are we in relationships with people so that we recognize a kind of shared humanity, so that the classics, as we define them, are relevant to the folks who live within 2 miles of of the Court Theater.
And honestly, that is some of the more exciting theater too, to see the performances that have been done so many times that we think we know what they look like, and to have them re-envisioned in a more modern way.
Yeah, I mean, and to articulate for ourselves what that really is. So yes, Sophocles, of course. But when we think about the 20th century and the plays that have been performed over and over again, we have to think about August Wilson. We have to think about Lorraine Hansberry. So classics include Sophocles, but they also include a much broader set of folks than white guys who died thousands of years ago. And of course, after Ferguson, we saw so many people make the play Antigone about their communities. So there's a way in which we can breathe new life into those plays that have been around for thousands of years as well. So so I was really excited about this situation that Court Theater was in, because it was so unique in that it was in a primarily African-American neighborhood, and it was concerned with the classics. It just seemed like a unique opportunity, and one that personally resonated for me.
Yeah, and honestly, you mentioned the Antigone performance, and I do remember not long ago, I'm from New York, and so I've seen many performances there, and I think it was at the it might have been that the foundation supported it, but the Onassis Foundation that's there did a version of the Antigone, and it was honestly my first time seeing one of what you're calling classics, because it wasn't what I would normally be drawn to, and immediately, because of how they told the story from a more relevant perspective, I was enamored, and I immediately went and purchased a book on classics, because I wanted to understand the larger stories behind it too, that maybe were not presented in the play. But it's a very accessible way of presenting the classics and showing why they're classic.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that's really important, and it's an exciting challenge, is to make it clear that works are classics because a multiplicity of communities find meaning in them. And if a multiplicity of communities can't find meaning in them, then they're not classics. And so they're not classics, or at least we don't accept that they're classics because professors say that they are, but instead because many different kinds of communities find relevance, and so they make them classics. It's communities that give the moniker of classics to a work. At least that's the way in which we're operating at Court.
So it's not the professors who do it, the ones who push it to you and say this is what you should read, and then you don't want to read it because somebody's telling you to read it.
Well, I mean, traditionally that's how the canon gets decided, right? It's like, who do professors teach? And so what books are being bought?
Exactly.
And instead of accepting that, I think we're more interested in, what texts through communities make sense of themselves through. And if enough communities do, then a piece of work is a classic.
It's a unique theater to be able to have that sort of interpretation. And also one that's unique in that it's on a university campus. It's all, there's a lot of, and on the south side of Chicago. So it is an amazing organization that you have an opportunity to lead, which is wonderful. You've had quite the experience over the years, though. I think it's if I did this right, 24 years working in Chicago in the cultural sector, from deputy commissioner of the Department of Cultural Affairs to Illinois Humanities, to Boeing.
Boeing was a really fascinating place to be for a number of reasons. One of them was that they were very, very clear about what they were setting out to accomplish. And what they were setting out to accomplish through their grant making was not to sustain the nonprofit sector, but it was really to accomplish a specific set of goals tied to the corporation very specifically. And I really appreciated that because it didn't feel like charity or doing anybody favors. And the relationships were mutual to an extent that they're not usually mutual in the funding world. So foundations pretend, for the most part, that they don't gain anything from the work that they do as funders, and Boeing never pretended not to.
And you worked for also Illinois Humanities. That's very much that same. It's a collaborative organization. It provides funding to nonprofits, but it does it in that collaborative sense of we will work together to make this happen, and to step into the corporate side and see a similar, or also create an environment that has that sense of collaboration is great.
Yeah, I mean, Illinois Humanities became a really different place the second time I was there. And it wouldn't have become that place had I not been at Boeing for the years that I was, because of that idea that you have to be clear about what your goals are. And I mean, to me, this is really fascinating. I don't know if other people will think it, but when I got to Illinois Humanities Council, Christina Velitis, who was
the second time or the first?
The second time.
So you were executive director.
I was program director and then executive director, right?
Okay.
Yeah. But Christina Velitis, who was the executive director before I became executive director of Illinois Humanities, had commissioned some research on people's views of Illinois Humanities. And what came out of, one of the things that came out of that study was that people didn't know what the humanities was and thus didn't know what they were for. And so there was a lot of confusion about what this organization actually was. And people also didn't understand why the humanities mattered. And to me, the humanities are so central to the concept of our democracy and for the perpetuation of it that it seemed a terrible shame to me that people didn't understand what an entity like Illinois Humanities would be for. And so it felt to me like we had to be really clear with ourselves as to what it is that we existed for to be able to work effectively. And so we asked a bunch of people who, who had been partners with Illinois Humanities over years, what should the humanities accomplish for society? And our entire way of working shifted as a result of those, dozens of conversations that we'd had. But
you came up with amazing programming out of that, because Envisioning Justice was, a project that you worked on while you were at Illinois Humanities that, I imagine then before that wouldn't have been something maybe that Illinois Humanities had worked towards. It's a unique program about incarceration, mass incarceration.
Yeah, and I take very little credit for Envisioning Justice, except I did the hard work of fundraising. But by the time I got back to Illinois Humanities, I realized that I was no longer like a young whippersnapper, and the best ideas weren't coming from me anymore. And the best approaches to doing community-based work weren't coming from me anymore. And again, I feel silly for saying that I didn't recognize it at the time, but the staff at Illinois Humanities, was really clear for themselves that the people we say are experts aren't really experts when it comes to incarceration. That, university presidents and company CEOs and the heads of nonprofits actually don't have expertise in incarceration in the way that people who are incarcerated or whose loved
Yeah.
ones are incarcerated have expertise. And so if we're going to try to tackle this issue, like a blue panel committee or a blue ribbon committee wasn't going to do it. Like we were going to get all the same answers that haven't
Fascinating.
worked.
Yeah.
And that was a really huge deal.
That's a big shift.
It's a huge shift. It was a really important shift. Again, maybe I was naive or silly not to have been able to articulate that at the time, but envisioning justice became what it did because of that.
Yeah, it was uplifting the voices of those who have experienced
Yeah.
incarceration or have been affected by,
Right.
versus the thinking about it from, as you say, as an academic perspective of how can we fix it because it, we've studied it,
Right.
we've analyzed it, we've gotten all the data points we
Right.
can from it, and we want to fix it that way.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's not the approach to go with. It really is about actual experience.
Yeah, and I think it points to a huge crack in our civic society, which is who do we go to try to seek answers? It was when I was at DCASE at the city that I really began to think about it, because it was when the mayor had decided to close a bunch of Chicago public schools.
Yes.
And the last people who were asked about how that should work were the families who were going to be directly impacted on that.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a good argument for why that could have gone either way, that decision about what schools to close. But it would have been a better decision, and it would have worked better if families were included from day one.
Yeah.
In a democracy, for a democracy to work, everyone has to sacrifice, but nobody is willing to sacrifice unless they willingly do it.
Yeah.
And if you don't give them the chance, then they won't go along with it. So it's a shame that our civic culture isn't one that goes to the people who are oftentimes don't go to the people who are most affected by an issue.
Yeah, and so talking about this civic culture, though, how does Illinois humanities, as you say, most people don't know what humanities even means, but it's about art and culture. And how did the arts play into this civic engagement in this conversation, especially with that project at Envisioning Justice? It wasn't about just finding the voices that needed to be heard. How did the arts help facilitate that?
I mean, first of all, and this is just a funny aside that nobody but me will care about, but at one point in the United States, we created a National Endowment for the Arts and a National Endowment for the Humanities, and we said that the arts and humanities are different things, and they're not. And so Illinois Humanities, to the shock of other state humanities councils, said we're actually going to do an art-centered initiative because it's an important part of the humanities. And I think the arts are really important because nobody will change their behavior out of shame. And it's one of the things that I think about a lot in this moment, the way in which we're trying to bring about change through a lot of shaming. And I think it's doomed to fail because nobody is motivated to do better by shame. And the way in which to critique our society or critique individuals in our society is to hold up a mirror in a way in which they're willing to see themselves. And that's the thing that the arts can do that no other field does, which is to provide a critique of our society and of individuals in a way that doesn't feel like an attack, or at least it doesn't bring about shame, even if it does, even if it is an attack. And it's one of the reasons why I've been so interested in a career in the arts, is because I feel like it's the most powerful tool we have for change. And people say that all the time. And I don't know if they're just giving it lip service or if they really believe it, but I really believe it. That actually, if we could put art in the hands of more people, and if we as both makers and receivers of it, that we would have a way more complex decision or discussion than we have in American culture now.
Right. It really does help us to have conversations that we're also not comfortable having
Right.
in just normal dialogue.
Yeah.
It gives us an outlet to express what we're feeling
Right.
in ways that might be more accessible to
Yeah.
people too, to have those more
Right.
difficult conversations. And that's what the Alliance is here to support.
Right.
That's obviously what the Court Theater is
Yeah.
reason to exist, is to help people have these conversations,
Yeah.
and to grow from them.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can use these tools that we have to make change, and especially today when it's so much more important. It's been important for years,
Right.
but we're at a point in our time in history that this shift that we're having is different than we've ever experienced. And
Yeah.
the use of technology now that we've some have spent time developing it because haven't had the resources to do so. But once things got into place and people updated their websites and got online, the reach that most organizations will be able to access now is huge.
Yeah.
It could be international.
Right.
It can be, regional. It can be, it changes the whole perspective on who your audience is.
Yeah, I think to divorce a notion of who we are to a specific geographic place
Yeah.
is a really important thing that's been happening.
Yeah.
The first set of seminars that we offered at Court, we had people from 28 different states and 2 other countries
Yeah.
sign up to take these courses. So we don't, but the only people who come see plays in the theater at Court
Yeah.
live in Chicago.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
not only can we now think about serving elderly people who can't get to our theaters for whatever reason, but we can also have a relationship with, people in Canada and Puerto Rico and
Right.
other places that we wouldn't have been able to serve,
Which
or that we
is-
hadn't thought to serve before.
Which is now a global presence for what we know as local neighborhood-based
Right.
cultural institutions that are staples to our communities. To the Court Theater to the South Side, many of our members in 30 different neighborhoods throughout the city are arts institutions
Right.
that people within their communities may or may not know, but they're still staples there.
Right.
But now that has broadened to a much bigger audience that we can think about and speak to and create new experiences for.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. I do want to share, you've spent a lot of time in programming, right? Yeah,
Yep.
that has been most of your career experience. And you've come up with a lot of exciting programs, like implemented in visiting justice and on all of these things. But when you and I first had a conversation, it was virtual. It was on
Right.
Zoom, even though we're neighbors, right? Even though
Right.
we're 2 doors down from each other, which we found out during this time. But you helped us in coming up with ideas for programming, which I don't know if you realized, and I wanted to
I think
share
the food thing.
the food thing.
Yeah,
And I wanted to share it because it was an interesting story about family for you too that you had to share. We came up with the idea of Taste from Home,
Right.
which ended up being a conversation about stories and recipes that relate to one's culture and what that means to them. But you had an interesting perspective on it that gave us this idea of not having maybe access to the culture that you are from and the food that is representative of your culture. Can you tell me more about that story?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you brought it up for a couple of reasons. And I think, let me give a shout out to Lisa Lee, who I think is a host committee member.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, this idea and recognition came about in my conversations with her. So, Lisa and I have collaborated on programming, over the past 2 decades. And she's a really exciting thinker and programmer. And I was telling her, I think, that there are some dishes that I grew up eating, but when I left home for college, I never lived with my family again or near them again. And I never learned how to make these dishes. And they're like, a really simple one is rice and beans.
Yeah.
Rice and beans that are cooked together. Like, you have to have just the right amount of water and cook it for just the right amount of time, or the beans are undercooked, or the rice are undercooked, or they're overcooked and they get really soft and gross. And I never learned to make those things when I was with my family, partly because we moved away from Belize. And
Right,
so
so
I
your
wasn't.
family's from Belize.
I'm
so
from
this
Belize.
Is, yeah,
right,
so
yeah,
this is
yeah.
rice and beans of Belize,
yeah.
which is going to be very different from everywhere else that
From
has
everywhere
rice and
else,
beans.
exactly, right. So, I left Belize when I was 11, and so I wasn't steeped in that culture any longer. And so I think I was talking about the fact that I never learned to make rice and beans because I was never in a place in which it was a natural thing to learn to cook the foods like that. And Lisa said, because we had access to this kitchen at the city, this training kitchen, let's start a program called something like Cooking with Grandma.
Yeah, well, love it. Yeah.
where women from certain ethnicities would teach classes, and they would be not geared at like the tourist who is interested in learning to cook food from another culture, but really they'd be geared at people from that culture who never learned to make them.
Yeah.
And I mean, if I can say something about the Alliance,
Absolutely, please.
because this makes me think of it. I've talked about why the arts are important to me because they allow us to critique ourselves in ways in which like direct criticism doesn't. And of course, they create arguments that are way more complex than most of the arguments that we have. But the other thing, and I feel this really strongly as an immigrant, they make you feel at peace or at home in a way that other things don't. It's like the other side of it.
Yeah.
And when I think about the cultural organizations that the Chicago Cultural Alliance works with and supports, a lot of the organizations do that work where their members or their audiences or the people who partake in their programming most are away from home permanently.
Exactly.
And as an immigrant, I don't think you ever feel fully comfortable in another country.
Yeah.
Or at least as an immigrant, I never feel 100% comfortable in America. I assume other immigrants have the same experience. And so finding a home in the arts, even if it's just like an hour at a time, is a huge deal.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a way to experience beauty that's accessible to you.
Yeah.
And for me, it's the flip side of the challenges that the arts can provoke. But it's the kind of peace that one gets from experiencing beauty, and beauty that you can make sense of.
Yeah, I appreciate that because it is, the Alliance works with 40 different cultural heritage centers throughout the city, each of them representing different cultures. Each of them, some of them participated in Taste from Home, sharing recipes of their own cultures, and just the food programming that they work on, the arts programming, it is all a piece of home for them that they're sharing. And they can share that with those that may not be home and are here, and Chicago is their home now, but have come from somewhere else. And that's a pretty unique aspect of, I want to say, Chicago too, to have so many, it's a city of neighborhoods, as we all know, and it's each neighborhood has created its own sense of home, has created its own sense of community. We have from Chinatown to Greek Town to the Swedish neighborhoods in Andersonville. There is this, they create this sense of community to show people what their home is like.
Yeah.
And that's what the arts is all about, right?
Yeah.
It's about creating a sense of home. I love how you said that.
Yeah.
And the thank you for the idea, and now more people will likely steal the idea from us about
good.
the grandmother.
Yeah, well, we never got to do it.
We
so
never got to.
Someone
We
should
didn't get
steal
to
it.
do it either, so someone should probably do it soon, maybe.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the idea of not being able to connect with family. That, for me, what resonated, honestly. It hit me personally, because when you described it as family that you won't be able to learn recipes from, or people that you've left behind. I've lost a lot of people that I wasn't able to find the time to find these recipes for, and it gave us a nice way of connecting around recipes and stories from other people's families,
Yeah.
to feel that sense of home too that maybe we missed out on.
Yeah. And I think in the arts, or at least the art circles that we often run in, people discount the sort of folk art
Yes.
way too much.
Mhm.
And in a way, like homegrown cooking is a
Mhm.
kind of folk art.
Yeah, it is.
And I think it's a mistake to discount that form of art,
Mhm.
because it is incredibly important for the soul.
Mhm.
And it's just accessible in a way that art often tries not to be.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
But we're all stressed out in our lives every day, and you can't really function without a place to retreat every now and then. And I think that's where folk arts, like food, but other forms of folk art that we
Yeah.
see in ethnic museums around Chicago, especially, it's a really important role that they play. Is that for lots of people, it's a place to retreat and to not be stressed out for
Yeah.
an hour at a time.
Yeah, but then at the same time, to bring it back around, to have conversation, to be civically engaged
Right.
at these institutions too.
Right.
And they not only bring the arts to the community, but they also help people get civically engaged,
Yeah.
and get people out to vote, and get people out to
Right.
take their census.
Yeah.
And that's
true.
it's
Yeah.
huge, and to fear the risk of losing many of these organizations is something that we hope to not see in the near future. And you did share a bit of message of hope about what the future can bring, but I'm curious. Next year is going to be a challenging time,
Yeah.
as we all know, especially for nonprofits. But I'm curious to hear what you're hopeful for in the arts sector for the future.
Yeah. I guess one of my hopes, and I'm beginning to see sort of a breadth and depth of conversation that I haven't seen before in terms of equity in the arts. I mean, well, I guess I'll speak specifically for theater.
Yeah.
I've never seen so many leaders of theaters around the country meet together regularly to figure out how to move more quickly towards equity. I think that it's one of the opportunities that this pandemic is perhaps allowing us.
Yeah. Gave us space.
Yeah, and so I'm hopeful that that will be one of the changes. And artists make work not for money, right? I mean, sadly, most cultural workers live somewhere near the poverty line, so they don't do it for money. And so I think artists will come back.
Yeah.
And maybe our institutions will look different.
Yeah.
That's a hope.
Yeah.
Is that our institutions will look different.
I am excited for what a lot of, especially some of the smaller organizations who have been changing so quickly, what their future looks like. It does look bright at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like in theater, in Chicago at least, the small theaters are going to be the first ones back.
Yeah, that's
because
fingers crossed.
they have been operating with very little earned income.
Yeah.
And so, for a theater the size of Court to not be able to sell half the tickets in the house has a huge economic impact.
Yeah.
I think for smaller theaters, I mean, my guess, I don't know, is that they can come back with half an audience
Yeah.
more easily,
Mhm.
and they're the ones that are doing most of the innovating anyway.
Yeah.
And so I'm personally excited to see what small theaters will do in Chicago, because I think they'll be the ones who will lead us out of the pandemic. And I think a lot of playwrights are writing plays right now.
They got a lot of time to
Yeah,
write.
and so I'm excited to see what comes out of this.
It's
And I
true.
think it's our small theaters,
Yeah.
within the world of theater anyway,
Mhm.
that will
Yeah.
show us the most exciting stuff first.
Yeah, and it's the same with cultural heritage centers and neighborhoods, and people will be more comfortable to go to their neighborhood theater, their
Right.
neighborhood museum, their neighborhood cultural center, because it's right in their
Right.
backyard, and that's what I'm hopeful for too.
Yeah.
I want to congratulate you again
Thank
on
you.
the award.
Thank you.
It's obvious that your breadth of experience in the cultural sector and your knowledge is why this award was made for you. And congratulations and thank you for contributing your voice to this conversation. And to your continuous support of the Chicago Cultural Alliance and the work that we do. You've always been a friend of the organization, and I look forward to working with you more in the future.
Thank you so much. I mean, the work of the Alliance has been so incredibly important, and I feel like its impact is increasingly more felt. And so I'm really honored to be given this award by the Chicago Cultural Alliance. And thank you for having me and for having this conversation today.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Angel.